Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Korean Studies. My name is Tae-Hong Baek, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. I'm very pleased to announce the beginning of the second Yang's lecture today. The 2021 Dr. Yang Sung-Chul's, just a moment. Dr. Sung-Chul Yang and Daisy Lee Yang lecture is held with the eminent scholar Dr. Ha-Joon Chang's talk that is entitled The Political Economy of Parasite. The Yang's lecture series began in 2018 with the generous support from Dr. Sung-Chul Yang and Daisy Lee Yang, who endowed this lecture series in order to facilitate the regular appearance of eminent scholars of Korean and Asian affairs at the University of Hawaii Manoa campus. The series was established to contribute to the building of a common ground that our world needs in order to resolve a conflict and create a more peaceful world. The inauguration of the Yang's lecture series had happened with a lecture presented by eminent scholar late Professor Jung-Sik Lee in 2018. Due to the pandemic, we could not host the lecture as planned the last couple of years. This year, we decided to host this lecture in a hybrid format. I hope we will have the third lecture in an in-person format for sure. Dr. Sang-Hyup Lee, economic professor and former director of the Center for Korean Studies, was the very person who made today's event possible. He wanted to initiate a world-class lecture series where we could invite prominent scholars or public figures. His dream was made possible because of the support from Dr. Yang. Today, Professor Lee will serve as a discussant following Dr. Ha-Joon Chang's talk. Since the two eminent economists were in the same class in SNU from 1982 until 1986, I think this will be a very special occasion. And I asked Professor Sang-Hyup Lee to give an introduction to Dr. Chang and his talk. After Dr. Chang's presentation and Professor Lee's discussion, we will have a Q&A session. Please feel free to type your questions to the Q&A link, which will be relayed to the speaker later. Without further ado, I will ask Professor Sang-Hyup Lee to take floor to introduce Dr. Chang. Thank you very much.
Aloha, I'm Sang-Hyup Lee. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ha-Joon Chang, Professor Ha-Joon Chang. Actually, he doesn't need any introduction. If you just search on Google and just type his name, you can see very long, actually, Wikipedia description of his career. But just for formality, I have to actually read his career. So, as you know, Ha-Joon Chang teaches economics at the University of Cambridge. He earned his Master of Philosophy and Ph.D. degree at the University of Cambridge. So he graduated from Seoul National University in the Department of Economics in South Korea. So he has published, he's very prolific. He has published 16 books and 11 edited books, including the Political Economy of Industrial Policy. I believe actually this is his dissertation. And the famous book, Kicking Away the Letter, was published around 2003. This book is also very famous because this won the famous Gunnar Myrdal Award. And then the Bad Samaritans. The Bad Samaritans also became so famous in Korea because this book was listed in blacklist actually in Korean army. And also the 20 things they don't tell about tell you about capitalism. So these all books are actually best sellers in Korea. That's why I actually make Ha-Joon very famous. Without any further ado, actually, I'll ask Professor Ha-Joon Chang to present his talk today.
Thank you, Professor Park and Professor Lee, for your kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to listen to me at a relatively early hour over there in Hawaii, although it's very late at night in England. It is my great honor to be invited as a speaker for Dr. Sung-Chul Yang and Dr. Daisy Lee Yang series. Of course, the University of Hawaii has a great tradition of Korean studies, probably one of the centers of Korean studies in the world. And I'm really honored to be invited to give such a prominent lecture for such an important place for Korean studies. Now, Korea, of course, when I say Korea, I mean South Korea, Republic of Korea, where I was born and grew up and went to university. The country has gone from one of the poorest economies in the world to one of the richest within, well, really less than a person's lifetime. Now, in 1961, on the eve of the country's miracle economic growth, because it all started with the 5-year economic development plan in 1962, Korea's per capita income stood at a paltry $93 per person. Let me share the screen. Do you have the full screen over there, or
Yeah, we see your PowerPoint screen, but not in a full screen mode.
That's right. Yeah, I don't know what's going wrong.
No, so that one, yes, correct. Click it. Then your screen might be hidden behind this, I think.
I don't know. Is that? That's strange. Let me try in another way.
Yes, it appeared.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. Okay, so that in 1961, South Korea's per capita income stood at $93. It was not the poorest country, because there were countries like Nepal and Haiti which were poorer. But basically, at that time, Korea's level of income was same as that of India, Kenya, and Nigeria. And many African countries actually had much higher income. For example, Madagascar, which is one of the poorest countries in the world at the moment, had $134 per capita income, which means it was 44% richer than Korea. Ghana had the income that was more than twice the Korean one. And Senegal had an income that was nearly 3.5 times higher. Today, Korea's per capita income, well, this is as of 2019, is $31,000. This is just under 10% lower than the average income of the European Union, which stands at $34,000. and it's just a shade below the Italian one, 7% higher than that of Spain's, 37% higher than that of Portugal's, and 62% higher than that of Greece. Now, this means that there are around 8 million Koreans who remember living like an average Nigerian or Indian, not even of today, of the early 1960s, who now live like an average EU citizen. I say 8 million because that's the number of Koreans who are over 65 today. That is, those who were born before 1955. I pick 1955 because few people remember much about what happened before they are 4 or 5. So I'm excluding those who are alive in 1961 but were under 5. So according to this calculation, there are 8 million people who basically travel from one of the poorest countries to the level of standard of living that is the average of the European Union. This is a remarkable achievement. But even more remarkable is the fact that Korea's economic growth was based on a radical transformation of the country's production structure and productive capabilities. It wasn't because it somehow hit oil or found some miraculously expensive mineral resources. In the early 1960s, Korea's top export items were primary commodities like tungsten ore, rice, and fish. Of course, it is a very poorly endowed country in terms of natural resources. So being based on those primary commodities, it had such a low standard of living. Even until the mid-1980s, after 2 decades of so-called miracle growth, Dasanai left the country to study in England. The country's main exports were labor-intensive products like textile, garments, trainers, and stuffed toys. Of course, today's main exports are sophisticated manufactured products like semiconductors, mobile phones, and automobiles. Now, the best way to illustrate the magnitude of this structural transformation that underlies the Korean economic development is to go back to 1976. That's the year when the Hyundai, the Korean car company, produced its first own design passenger car model called Pony. Now, Hyundai Business Group was set up in the late 1940s by the legendary entrepreneur Chung Ju-young. Initially, it was a construction company, but from the 1960s,
Recording in progress.
From the 1960s, the company started branching into the other activities. And in 1967, it set up a car company as a joint venture with the American company Ford. Initially, Hyundai assembled a Ford model called Cortina, which was actually first developed in Ford UK. So Hyundai imported most of the important parts and assembled this car and sold them locally. And initially, it was a very small operation. I mean, it didn't even produce 3,000 of these cars in the first few years. But in 1973, the company announces that this is going to develop its own model. Now, this is not totally voluntary because in the same, it was because this announcement was made because the Korean government in that year announced that it's going to cancel the license for automobile manufacturers if they don't come up with their own models. So at the time, there were 3 automobile companies, all joint ventures with foreign companies. And General Motors stuck around, but Ford and the other company, Fiat, left their joint ventures with Korean companies because they found the idea of developing a local model rather absurd. Hyundai went independent and designed this model called Pony, which went into production in 1976. In the first full year of production in 1976, Hyundai produced just over 10,000 Pony cars. To put it in perspective, but in the same year, General Motors produced 4.8 million cars, and Ford produced 1.9 million cars. So 10,000 against nearly 5 million of General Motors and nearly 2 million of Ford. I still remember that in that year, Korea also managed to export the Pony cars. Well, it sounds like a joke now, but it actually exported the Pony cars first to Ecuador, which at the time was actually richer than South Korea. So there was a big headline in newspapers saying Korea exports its cars. It turned out that they sold 5 cars to Ecuador and 1 bus. But I still remember the Koreans being so proud. Now we can export things like cars, not just stuffed toys and T-shirts anymore. Anyway, so if you had a time machine and went back to 1976 and told people that this is a totally unknown automobile manufacturing in Korea, which at the time was still quite a poor country, even after 15 years of rapid growth, its per capita income was not even 2/3 that of Ecuador's in that year. And if you told that people that this car company from this poor country, without the production run that is 0.2% of General Motors and 0.5% of Ford, this car company is going to be bigger than Ford in just over 30 years and will make more cars than General Motors in less than 40 years, people would have tried to put you in a mental hospital. But this is what happened. From 2009, Hyundai produced more cars than Ford. From 2015, it has produced more cars than General Motors. So this is the kind of transformation we are talking about. Moreover, the benefits of economic development in Korea was rather evenly distributed. During the so-called miracle growth period, Korea experienced very little deterioration in income distribution. Between the 1960s and mid-1980s, it depends on which indicator you look at, depends on which study you look at, but income distribution basically stayed more or less the same or became a little bit worse. But between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s, it definitely got better. So overall, during the miracle growth period of the early 60s and mid-1990s, the country's income distribution improved. So this is quite unusual because at best the income distribution will get worse and then get better, or it would get worse. But Korea defied that international trend and achieved rapid growth with improving income distribution. So country with such remarkable achievement, but today there's something terribly wrong with the country. The country has one of the 10 highest suicide rates in the world. Between the mid-1990s until 2015, it actually had the highest suicide rate in the OECD. So high that its suicide rate was between 2.5 and 3 times higher, depending on the year, than the OECD average. In 2015, Lithuania joined the OECD, and they have a suicide rate higher than that of Korea. So Korea was knocked off the throne, but that it has a remarkably high suicide rate. Suicide is particularly high among older people over 50. So there's something suspicious there. And while the old ones are killing themselves in droves, the young are in deep despair. And there's this expression.
Would you please move ahead with your PPT slide as well? PPT is not moving along.
Oh yeah, it's not supposed to move. I don't have.
I'm sorry. I thought it is. You're moving ahead. I'm sorry. Please, sorry to interrupt you.
It's just the numbers. Yeah. The young people in Korea these days call the country Hell Joseon. Joseon being the name of the country under the last dynasty, and the name still preferred by North Korea. So they call the country Hell. According to some opinion surveys, half of the young people say they want to migrate to another country if they can. The cultural world is brimming with books and dramas aimed at young people, telling them that it's okay not to be okay. Yeah? So embrace unhappiness. Yeah? Don't be unhappy about being unhappy. Young people have stopped having children. Korea now has literally the lowest fertility rate in the world by some margin. I haven't checked the historical data, but this could be a record. This could be the lowest fertility rate in human history that has been at least recorded. And this the state of affairs in today's Korea is brilliantly depicted in the first ever non-English language winner of the Academy Award for Best Picture, Parasite, by the Korean director Bong Joon-ho. And the political economy behind this movie is what I want to talk about. The most important theme in the Parasite is, of course, that of inequality, as many of you know. And inequality is a very common theme in movies from around the world, like the Brazilian one, City of God, the Mexican one, Roma, the British one, I, Daniel Blake. Some of you must have seen at least some of these movies. They're all great movies. But the story in Parasite is a story of inequality that is very unique to Korea, and I'm going to explain how it is unique. Korea is currently one of the most unequal countries in the rich world. Only the United States is consistently more unequal than South Korea among countries with more than $30,000 per capita income. Some years, the UK, Israel, occasionally New Zealand, they might be more unequal than Korea, but basically it's one of the four most unequal countries in the rich world, and usually second or the third most unequal, depending on which year you look at. But the notable thing is that this relatively high inequality is a recent phenomenon. Of course, there was the high inequality in Korea during the feudal period and during the Japanese rule. But on the eve of the miracle growth period in the early 60s, Korea was quite an equal society, at least by the standard of the developing countries, which it was at the time. Because the Japanese colonial rule, decolonization, the Second World War, the Korean War, all these upheavals flattened the social hierarchy and reduced the wealth inequality. And finally, after the liberation from the Japanese, rather extensive land reform in the 1940s and 50s made the countryside very equal. And I mentioned earlier that inequality didn't rise during the miracle years. It has even slightly fallen, depending on the data you look at. So it was for what it was quite an equal country until the mid-1990s. But things began to change from that point. Now, what is most important to remember is that in keeping inequality relatively low, Korea actually did not rely on redistributing income through the welfare state, that as it is usually the case with other countries that have. The welfare state was negligible until the 1980s and was very small even in the 1990s. So the welfare state, measured by social spending as a proportion of GDP, was a mere 2.7% in 1990 and 3.1% in 1995. To put it into perspective, the OECD average for social spending for the size of the welfare state is 20% of GDP. The US, which has a relatively small welfare state by the standard of the rich world, still spends 18.7% of GDP on social welfare. So you can imagine how small this welfare state that accounts for only 3% of GDP is. Yeah? The way Korea kept this inequality low was not by the welfare state, but by restraining the ability of the market to generate inequality in the first place. So there were measures intended at protecting the weak and restraining the strong. So small farms were protected. There was the land reform, but unlike in other countries that had land reform, there was a very strict imposition of ceiling on agricultural land ownership. In many countries, you have the land reform, and after 10, 20 years, poor peasants sell the land back to the former landlord class because they cannot sustain their farms. In Korea, that didn't happen because the ownership of agricultural land more than a really tiny size, like 1 hectare, I think it was legally not allowed. Small shops were protected. There were ban on the large retailers. And the countries that are full of these small shops are called 구멍가게, which literally means hole in the world shop. So you have, actually this is quite big for Gumang Gage. You have shops like this, tiny space, selling a little bit of everything. And the funny thing is that these are called super or super after supermarket. There's nothing supermarkety about it, but somehow these the small corner shops got to have this name. So these days, actual supermarkets are called marts in Korea. Small firms are also protected. Of course, that in the bigger scheme of things, the large firms, especially these big conglomerates called chaebol, were favored by the government and given huge disproportionate support. But there were kind of provisions to allow at least some of these small firms in low tech sectors to survive. Until 1997, there was this law which reserved certain industries for small and medium-sized enterprises, like milling rice, making tofu, making noodles, things like that. So that at least some small firms could survive in the cracks in the system. Workers were, of course, massively repressed, but even there was some protective measures until the mid-1990s. The firing was formally quite difficult, and then there was the informal lifetime employment arrangements for regular workers in large companies. Not as widespread or strong as in Japan, but significant enough. And then at the top end, there was financial repression, basically ban or strong restrictions on speculative finance, which limited the possibilities of large gains. There were also cultural caps on top salaries. So, yeah, there was no kind of formal salary cap, but executives of even large companies were receiving quite modest sums by the standard of especially the United States, but by the standard of most other countries. Of course, Korea is actually not the only country which kept inequality low in this way. Japan used to do this in some ways even more strongly until the 1990s, although it is now playing a completely different game. Japan has become quite unequal in the last couple of decades. Switzerland still keeps many of these measures. So it's not unique entirely to Korea, but the thing about Korea is that it's now kind of falling apart. Anyway, so reduction of inequality was achieved through restraining the market rather than redistributing income. Now, reduction of inequality through income redistribution is not the only function of the welfare state, of course, because its more important function is a provision of collective insurance against shocks of life, unemployment, illness, retirement, and so on. And when you think about it, this is indeed why the welfare state is sometimes called the social safety net. Now, during the miracle years, despite having very small welfare state, Korea was able to deal with these issues of safety net. First of all, because there was a rapid growth and it was relatively easy to find a job. So that a lot of people, I mean, of course, these jobs are very hard, during those years, Korea literally the longest working hours in the world. Average working hour being between 55 and 60 hours per week, which of course is shorter than what British workers work during the Industrial Revolution, during which the average working hours was something like 80 hours. But by the standard of the 1960s and 70s, Korea the longest working hour. There was a lot of violence on the shop floor, so that many jobs were very hard and unpleasant, but still that jobs were being created all the time. And over time, these jobs were getting better and better in the sense that they paid better, they involved more skills, they were physically less demanding. At the same time, the social insurance function was fulfilled mainly by the extended family. The traditional extended family hadn't disintegrated until then. So a lot of people were relying on their extended families to cope with the shocks of life. You get unemployed, and maybe your brother will pay for your children's tuition until you get a job. You fall sick, and maybe your cousin will help you with hospital money and that kind of thing. So the life was harsh during the miracle years, but it was a society that had hope. Things were getting, at least in material terms, better all the time. That you didn't have a welfare state, but you had the people who could take care of you if you fell into trouble. That is the traditional extended family. And indeed, if you look at the suicide rate, which I think is a good indicator of how hopeful people are about the future, until the mid-1990s, Korea had actually below average suicide rate by OECD standard. So it isn't actually traditionally a high suicide society. It used to be actually below average suicide country. And after the mid-1990s, in a few years, it just jumps up to a level so high that other countries are not even close. This change came about in the mid-1990s. First of all, the country elected the first fully civilian government in 32 years in 1993, and this government started implementing liberalization measures, especially in the financial sector, the agriculture sector, and the labor market. The main force driving the liberalization measures were the chaebols, or the large conglomerates, which wanted to break away from the restraints put on them by the state. And their push for liberalization was helped by the fact that most people associated, understandably, interventionist policies with military dictatorship, and thought that political liberalization also required economic liberalization. This liberalizing trend vastly accelerated with the 1997 financial crisis. Well, never mind that the crisis was actually mainly caused by premature and poorly designed financial liberalization measures of the mid-1990s. Following the crisis, the US and other rich countries used the International Monetary Fund's rescue program as a lever to open up and liberalize Korean markets, especially the financial market. The chaebols, quite a few of them went bankrupt during the crisis, but the ones that have survived continued with their pressure on the government so that they could expand their business in areas that had hitherto been closed from them, especially in the retail sector. They also wanted to weaken the power of the workers by pushing further with labor market deregulation, things like allowing agency workers, and things like that. They also internally largely did away with lifetime employment practice, using the crisis as an excuse while ditching the old norm on the top salaries. And in a somewhat unexpected political alliance, during this period, the former left-wing activists joined forces with the internationalized upper professional class, financiers, lawyers, and accountants to campaign for further liberalization of the financial market, as they saw this as the most effective way to restrain the power of the chaebols, basically by inviting foreign capital. One of the results of those neoliberal reforms is the intensification of the inequality problem that is depicted in Parasite. Now, how did this happen? First of all, the neoliberal policies brought about slow growth. Now, some of you might be surprised by this statement because neoliberalism is known for its growth machismo, if you like. There's a doctrine which says, oh, don't worry about that, this cuddly, soft things like inequality and the environment. The most important thing is that to generate more growth. However, that's the rhetoric, and the reality is very different. Neoliberalism has proved not to be good even for economic growth. The policies associated with neoliberalism discourage economic growth, as the excessively liquid financial market that comes from financial deregulation discourages long-term oriented investment, first by creating heightened economic uncertainty, but more importantly, by giving too much power to short-term oriented investors. Now, investors are impatient. Unless you deliver the result in a couple of quarters, they will leave and invest in other firms. So companies become very short-term oriented, and they generate profit basically by not investing, especially in things that bring long-term returns. Also, the heightened inequality that neoliberal policies create reduce investment and growth by increasing political instability and depressing demand, as richer people have lower propensity to consume. This is what the talk about the so-called secular stagnation is about these days. Indeed, if you look at the record, the world economy grew in per capita terms at something like 2.6% between 1955 and 1980. Since then, it has grown at 1.5%. Actually, growth has decelerated. The same happened in Korea. The economy grew in per capita terms at around 6% per year during the miracle years. After the crisis, it has been struggling to grow at 3%. Slow growth has meant a much more slow creation of employment. This has resulted in high youth unemployment, but also early redundancy of older workers in their early 50s or even late 40s. Now we are really entering the parasite territory. When these workers became redundant, they could not rely on the welfare state to help them retrain and find a new job, as workers can in many European countries, especially in Scandinavia. At the same time, rapid industrialization, urbanization that preceded had brought about the disintegration of the traditional extended family, so they had nowhere to lean on. At the same time, welfare state failed to grow in step with that changing social reality in Korea. Korean welfare state still account for only about 11 to 12% of GDP, which is among the smallest in the OECD. Actually, the only countries that are poorer than Korea, much poorer, like Turkey, Chile, Mexico, they have a smaller welfare state. And not even that smaller, except for Mexico. Korean social spending level is basically half that of the US. Which has a quite small welfare state by the standard of its income. Countries like France and Finland, Denmark, they spend nearly 30% of GDP on the welfare. I'm not necessarily saying that having a bigger welfare state is a good thing, but you can see how Korea's welfare state is so minuscule. So given this, the only option left to these the redundant older workers was to use their severance payments to set up their own businesses. Many of these self-employed people are concentrated in small restaurants and bars and small shops, which the people who have been to Korea must have recognized to be so numerous. I remember about 10 years ago seeing this news report in the Korean newspaper saying that Korea has the highest number of fried chicken shops per capita in the world, despite being only something like the 10th largest consumer of chicken. Well, restraints on the market forces are still quite strong in Korea compared to those in the other rich countries. So in terms of the distribution of market income, that is income distribution before tax and transport through the welfare state, Korea is still the second most equal country in the OECD after Switzerland. It used to be actually the most equal country in terms of market income distribution until recently, but recently it has lost that position to Switzerland because there has been so much deregulation. I mean, it hasn't happened in a big bang way, but it has been relentless. And as a result, small businesses have been increasingly squeezed by large competitors. Small shops are being pushed up by supermarkets. Large-scale restaurant chains are driving out small restaurants. These the supermarket and restaurant chains are frequently owned by the chaebols. So a lot of these small businesses have been going bankrupt, but people still keep getting into these because there are few alternatives. So in the Parasite, we gather from the snippets from the conversation in the taxi driver's buffet restaurant that oh, sorry, no, I should have mentioned this. Korea still has a very high self-employment rate that is about 25%. EU average is 15%. US is like 6%. Yeah, so there's that kind of fact checking. Americans that love to present themselves as entrepreneurs, but actually it's the least entrepreneurial country in the world. If you count the proportion of people who are their own bosses. Anyway, so in the movie, we learned that Ki-taek, the father of the poor Kim family, has failed actually no less than in two such the ventures. They talk about the fried chicken shop, and then the Chinese Castella shop. I mean, the Castella is this bread which apparently has the kind of Portuguese origin, but have spread to Taiwan and Japan, which had the long-running association with Portugal. Anyway, there was a craze on the Chinese Castella, but these the guys who were running these franchises that really didn't kind of support their franchisees very well, and then there was over competition. There were so many Chinese Castella shops that a lot of them went bankrupt. So in the movie, we learned that he failed first in the fried chicken, and then that failed in the Chinese Castella, and then we later learned that this guy Kunze, the guy who's living in the basement of the house of the rich Park family, he also failed in the Chinese Castella. And in the recent hit drama from Korea, the Squid Game, we also learned that Ki-hoon, the guy, the number 456, the guy on the right-hand side of the picture, he also ran huge debts because he failed in his fried chicken shop. Yeah? So behind the descent of the two families, Ki-taek's family and Kunze's family, in the Parasite, behind their descent into abject poverty lies the political economy of inequality of neoliberal Korea. Neoliberal reforms slow down economic growth, reducing the number of stable and well-paying jobs. They have also had reduced legal protection of workers while vastly weakening the norm of lifetime employment. So a large number of older workers in their 40s and 50s were forced into redundancy. Many of them get into these small restaurants and shops and then go bankrupt, and then they begin their descent into the abject poverty. If there were a decent welfare state, it could have helped at least some of them. If the traditional extended family still existed, many of them could have been picked up. But unfortunately, neither of these were there. So for most of them, the only option was that trying their best to make money by running fried chicken shops and selling Chinese Castella. I also remember some years ago, there was a huge boom in the Malaysian coffee bun. You know, the list is quite long. Unfortunately, that these ventures failed increasingly more and increasingly frequently because the markets keep getting deregulated. So, weakening of the employment creation, reduction in the stability of employment, absence of the welfare state, all of this conspire to, drive people who used to have decent jobs. In the Squid Game, Gi-hoon also used to work in a car parts factory. These people then try their hand at being the owners of fried chicken shops and small restaurants and so on, and then they fail, and then they try to make ends meet by engaging in casual jobs like being substitute drivers, and then doing kind of low-skill piecework like folding pizza boxes, which is what the Kim family does at the beginning of the movie Parasite. An additional glimpse into the Korean inequality story that you get from Parasite is regarding the role of education in the reproduction of inequality. In the movie, the first entry by the poor Kim family into the rich Park family is provided by the hiring of Kyu, the son of the Kim family, as a private tutor for Dae, the high school-aged daughter of the Park family. In today's Korea, private tutoring, at least attending a hagwon or cramming school, is so important in getting admissions into better universities. And in turn, attendance of better universities vastly increases your chance of getting better paying and more secure jobs, strongly determining your future. Some of you might have watched the Korean drama series called Sky Castle, in which the education, the problem is very well depicted. Of course, even in the old days, there were hagwons and private tutors. Even in our days, there were those things, but they are not even nearly as important as they are today, as the university entrance tests at the time were more primitive. What I mean is that a lot depended on very simple multiple choice exams, which didn't really need that much technique. And even when it wasn't multiple choice exams, raw intelligence that enabled you to do well in a few key subjects, Korean, English, and mathematics, would get you into good universities. So there was a relatively little advantage that you could get from private tutoring or hagwon. So in those days, of course, even in those days, you still had kids from more privileged background having better study environment, better nutrition, and having all these advantages. But at least in terms of kind of exam taking techniques, in terms of university entrance, meeting university entrance requirement, your family background gave you relatively little privilege. So this is why in the old Korea, it was possible for you to be born in a poor peasant family and make it literally to the very top of society. Supreme Court judge, CEO of a major company, top scientist, neurosurgeon in a big hospital, you name it. Unfortunately, these days, both school exams and university entrance exams are much more sophisticated than in the old days, making it difficult for kids without coaching in exam taking skills to do well. Moreover, in the name of selecting more rounded individuals, universities have taken into account extracurricular activities. I hear that this aspect is going to be watered down or even eliminated in the near future. But in the last couple of decades at least, they looked at all those extracurricular credentials. So it gave the huge advantage for families that could, pay for tutoring, that will get help their children get prizes in international math Olympiad. I mean, that families that who could provide their children with opportunities to do volunteer work in orphanages or even sending them to poor communities in developing countries, the families that could use their social connections to arrange impressive internships in university labs, international law firms, and investment banks. They have also, they all have enormously increased the chance of their children's university entrance. I mean, this aspect of the university admissions is very familiar to the American audience, but this is quite new to Korea, and is not really practiced in the most European countries, including Britain, despite this other problems with the private education and so on. Anyway, so now the Korean education system is organized in such a way that family income and wealth have much greater influence on education attainment, and therefore one's economic position in the long run. In the context of rising inequality, the inequalizing effect of this system is even more magnified. But despite this, the myth of social mobility through a meritocratic education system persists, partly because it has worked so well in the past, so people still think it can work, but also because those who benefit from it have an interest in sustaining the myth. So as a result, education, once a very effective system of choosing the more capable for better jobs, is slowly becoming an obstacle to, rather than a vehicle for social mobility. The increasing importance of family background in social mobility has not yet reached the level you see in countries like the US or the UK, but the fact that this has been increasing rapidly in the last couple of decades has created a strong sense of hopelessness among the young generation. So that there's an expression in English that someone's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. In Korea, younger people from less privileged background say that they were born with an wooden spoon or even a dirt spoon made of dirt. Okay, let me conclude. As dramatically depicted in the movie Parasite, the problem of inequality, poverty, and falling social mobility, and the resulting sense of frustration and hopelessness, all of this is pushing the Korean society to a breaking point. Despite the country's remarkable socio-economic achievements in the last 2 generations. One way to deal with the problem may be to restore at least some elements of the old system, especially reversing some deregulation measures to protect the weak. I mean, there's a constant appeal by the small shopkeepers and so on, that for the government to protect what they call the alley market, the traditional small shops that have been the mainstay of the retail market in South Korea, which are now being driven out by chaebol-owned supermarket chains. But I think the forces of deregulation are too strong to be reversed in a fundamental way, not least because consumers benefit from having large, more efficient retailers and restaurant chains. Also, I think the old-style protection-based system is unfair on those who do not have the numerical importance or organizational power to acquire protection. So my view is that the problems of Korea today have to be mainly dealt with by constructing a citizenship-based welfare state that befits the country's level of economic development and social conditions. And in this, I would argue that we cannot exactly copy what they are doing in, I don't know, Sweden or the Denmark, because Korea has such high level of self-employment. We need to find the way to incorporate the self-employed into the welfare system, which is not as easy to do as incorporating workers working for large company. So we need to think about that aspect more carefully. And this should be complemented by a reform of the education system in a way that reduces the influence of family income on educational achievements. I mean, of course, these things can, realistically speaking, not be eliminated, but there are ways to reduce these the influences. And indeed, the strengthening of the welfare state will also have the impact of reducing the achievement gap between students that come from different family background. And this is what we need to create synergy between welfare reform and education reform. This is why we need to create the synergy. Sorry. Finally, I would end my speech by saying that I believe that without these changes, Korea now runs the danger of becoming a nation that has a brilliant future, but brilliant past, but a very bleak future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang. It was a very, very insightful presentation. And I'm very glad to hear about your view on inequality, poverty, and falling social mobility, and a way to go to cure the current problems that Korean society is encountering, even if we also see a great achievement Korean society has had. Following Dr. Chang's presentation, next to me, Professor Sang-Hyuk Lee is sitting to give his discussion. And after this discussion, we will have time to ask questions and some further discussions. Professor Lee?
Thank you, Dr. Tae-Hong Baek. So I have actually a PowerPoint slide, so please open the PowerPoint. So in this presentation, Ha-Joon presents a political economy of the Korea's inequality using the movies such as Parasite. Right? So next slide. So Korean dramas are very popular. Films are very popular these days. Even though these two, dramas or films have different themes, actually more likely on the right-hand side is like survival game or winner takes all, and the left-hand side they actually focus on more inequality. They criticize the current contemporary the society of Korea, and it's very good actually. These films are very good. Next slide. But next slide. Okay, so let me begin with the picture. In this picture, you can see actually the Ha-Joon, the Chang Ha-Joon actually in the blue circle. And in green circle, actually, that's me. So we are very young. We are only 22 years old. By the way, actually, it's Ha-Joon's birthday today. So happy birthday, Ha-Joon. And
thank you.
Happy birthday.
And then, but the most important thing is the year. If you look at the year, it's 1986, the year 1986, right? Suicide, low fertility or population aging, housing, preparing for like this public sector jobs. These days, many people actually, many college students actually have study to enter this job. I mean, to find this job in public sector, and generational conflict, and even inequality were not the most important socio-economic issues. Of course, those are always issues, but those are not the most important words, buzzwords. 10 years later, things have dramatically changed. Next slide. So these movies which criticize the society existed. In 1970s, 80s, you can see those movies actually. These movies are actually very different from like Parasite or Squid Game in several ways though. Because if you look at the movies like on the left hand side, the little small ball, shot by the midget. I mean, all these movies actually, also the Fine Windy Day, they criticize Korean society, and also it presents and describes the people in precarious conditions, and the Kurwariraang, or the evil of strike too. But if you look at all these themes, the one word you can imagine is the industrialization. It's more about industrialization. So the social phenomenon, and also the precarious people under the process of industrialization, the Parasite and Squid Games do not talk about industrialization at all. So, for example, like in 1930s, you probably remember like Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, or neo-socialist movies like Bicycle Thieves in Italy. Those are kind of similar to these movies, but not similar to Parasite or Squid Games. Actually, there is a very interesting interview by Jo Se-hee. He's the author of this the movie, the Small Ball Shot by the Midget. He said in 2008, he said in 1978, I've never imagined the book would be also read 30 years later. What is certain is if the future is like now, it's hopeless. The funny thing, the ironic thing is actually 70s and 80s, there were hope. So even though these movies actually criticize, they try to overcome the situation. So hope, opportunities, those were actually, those existed in 70s and 80s. Next slide. The real ironic thing is, next slide. These 70s and 80s are actually often called the success story. Although many issues, right? So as Ha-Joon mentioned, Korea, has many issues. It's top ranked number 1 or ranked 2 among OECD countries, and low fertility rate actually decreased even further. So 0.884, which never happened in human history, and the highest suicide rate for some age groups, and the highest level for participation of older people, and high inequality, and also highest poverty rate among older people in OECD countries. So some actually people are very cynical. They say, oh, Korea likes number 1, but that's not it, right? So, and also importance of education, as Ha-Joon mentioned. And there is a huge wasteful competition to enter, university, and to get some jobs and to survive actually. And the name value of university is important. It creates a huge signaling cost, but it's also paid for some people who win by Squid Game. And this has actually transferable wealth. So in the past, actually, the parents didn't pay that much attention to children if they are, very wealthy. If they are very rich, then kids do not have to study. But now, this education is a reproduction tool of transferring wealth or poverty. So because of the private education is cost so high, people are not married or have a low fertility. Next slide, please. And Korea is characterized by the segmented labor market. And, you already know that, people actually have jobs in big companies that they cannot survive. So they retire in early 50s. So they have a bridge jobs and open the chicken or beer shop. But for firms, actually, there is no reason to keep workers until they get older, because in Korea, it's like there is no flexibility in both labor demand and supply side. So the firms actually are repeating this behavior. They kick them out when they get like early 50s and hire young people because they pay lower wage. And inequality is actually several folds. In addition to the education or jobs, the generation is such an important word in Korea, right? So there is no hope, opportunities, and that's actually very common themes these days. And the regional development. In Korea, you say, oh, we are living in Gangnam, Gangbuk, and Seoul, Gyeonggi versus the other area. Actually, this is related with also current, not just the industrialization in 70s and 80s, but also current kind of innovation. Because the innovation in Pangyo Valley, everything is actually concentrated in Gyeonggi and near Seoul area. And the importance of asset, because if you watch the Parasite movie, there is actually many level, right? So semi-basement, and there is also basement. And then apartment and or penthouse is a status of, in Korea, right? There are reasons, as Ha-Joon mentioned, there is no jobs, especially after 50s, and the family system is deteriorating. And the government's welfare state, the government spending on social welfare is low. So the only way actually to survive is asset, because there is no other way. The only four ways can support your life. So another issue is actually gender-related issues, but I skipped that part. Next slide. So the natural question is Korea unique? Korea, when you talk about Korea, we should talk about opportunity and generations, right? So all this, the history. But there are also many countries which face the same problems, right? Education cost, is very, very high in some countries, and Latin America has very high inequality. But Korea is a very rare case, actually, that these gears are so closely connected to each other. We can start from any gear, like education. Education cost is so high, right? So the families in the past, their parents actually spend so much time, so much money, and it leads to actually old age poverty. And also because of this segmented labor market, only some people get a job, and it leads to youth unemployment. And those who are kicked out of companies become self-employed. And the high education cost also lead to low fertility. And then, the only way, maybe the best way to move up to the high ladder is to have a high wealth. So people invest on asset or housing, and then people also borrow money to buy the house. Young people cannot do it. They probably invest in something like a Bitcoin. So it has a negative linkage versus a positive linkage. That means actually, even though one problem is solved in one sector, like education, if other problems exist because it's of a negative linkage, the problem may exist in Korea. That's why Korea may be unique. However, the positive linkage is that if one problem, say, education is solved, it may have a positive effect on other gears. So I think this is actually very unique, because other countries, like I said, have similar problems. They actually have jabber. In like Mexico, not OECD countries, they have a big conglomerate, and also they have these problems, probably less than Korea. But I think Korea is a very unique case. Next. So the discussion topics, actually time is running out. So are neoliberalism, jabber, and or deregulation really the main source of the problems, or are the more structural issues, as I mentioned? Next one is, of course, how to mitigate the problem. Restore some of the old system, especially the deregulation, strengthen the welfare state, And the third one is it's actually very difficult question because you may remember actually the 인곡궁 사태 or 남북단일체 논란. So sometimes to recovering equal opportunity hurts so-called equal process for competition. So two values often conflict each other, and the young generation sometimes don't like it. They always, they criticize the recent debate, from the recent debate. They criticize that achieving equal opportunity, like allowing, the informal sector work, the irregular workers or part-time workers, and giving them status of regular workers is not good because they spend so many time to pass the exam. So something like that. So this is a very subtle issue. So anyway, Ha-Joon, I always admire your work, and again, this is a good opportunity. And thank you so much because I know you're busy, really busy, much busier than I am. So again, thanks. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. It is really a great pleasure to see two classmates get together in the same panel. And I myself also was in the same generation, and I have known Professor Chang for a long time. So it's really great. Recently, actually a couple of months ago, my brother recommended an audio book titled 20 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And I actually listened to the audio book without knowing who wrote it. And the voice was very smooth, and I didn't think it is from somebody that I know of. But it was actually written by Dr. Chang, and it was so amusing and impressive. So I'm very glad to have this chance to ask a question to him directly. Currently, we have a couple of questions already written in the Q&A. And I'm sure Dr. Chang wants to respond to some of the comments made by Professor Lee. So I'd like to first just remind you of the first question, which you can combine with your comments to Professor Lee's discussion. So one participant asked whether you can comment on the role of the big brands in Korea, such as Samsung, their contribution to the wealth of the country and their share in terms of the GDP and its contribution to that economic development in country kind of a prosperity. So you might touch a little bit about that, and also feel free to give some comments on Dr. Lee's comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, Sang-Hyuk has given you a much richer and more systematic picture of the issues that I was talking about. He also covered many more aspects than I did. So, I'm only grateful for his comments. I would like to kind of continue the conversation in the future with him, but I think at this point I just thank him for bringing many more aspects of the problem into the story. How to assess the contributions of chaebol like Samsung? It is such a contentious issue, and I think that Koreans have, in a way, wasted too much energy talking about it. Well, my view is that these companies, they often like to say that they are the company of the Korean people, 국민 기업. And I think that that's how we should see it. but not in the sense that these chaebols want us to see it, because it happened in the almost all the other rich countries in the past, but in the Korean case, these companies were made successful not just by the people who are running it, not just by the people who own the shares, not even just by the workers who work for them, but the whole nation. The whole nation that had to buy the shoddy products like early Pony, the early Samsung TV, to make them survive the initial phase of their development, because the government basically banned the import of all cars until the mid 1990s and late 1980s, and then provided that huge subsidies through state-owned banks, taxpayers' money, so that the whole nation grew these companies together. And I think that's how we need to understand what these companies' contributions are and what these companies' the duties are for the nation. So I don't agree with people who say, "Oh, we could have done even better if we didn't have this huge conglomerates, economic model based on the small and medium-sized enterprises would have been better." I completely disagree with that view. But I also completely disagree with these conglomerates, spokespeople for these conglomerates, who want to present their success as their own achievement. The whole nation work together to build these companies, and what to do with their succession and their ownership and everything. I think that needs to be seen from that. I mean, if you like, maybe it's the wrong word, from that nationalist perspective. I mean, these are products of nation building, national development. You cannot just treat them as properties of shareholders, not to speak of properties of the families who are descended from the founders of these companies. So let's leave it at there.
Okay, so there are very interesting questions. One question is about my last point. Actually, it's related. So one question is, the opportunity is not guaranteed. So we actually talk about equal opportunity, but isn't it time to talk about actually equal equity of opportunities or chances? So this is actually related to the topic that I mentioned, right? So it's more like a meritocracy. So how do you ensure a society which ensure equity? So that's the one question.
No, of course. I think we all want an equal and fair society, but first of all, the problem is our definition of what is equal, what is the fair is different. So we need a proper conversation about it. But I think that however you may define it, the problem with all of this is that there are so many layers to this problem, because equal opportunity, is not something that we actually have even in I don't know, Finland or Sweden. There is still gender-based discrimination, race-based discrimination. In some countries it's the worst because you rig the rules. I mean, one big gripe I have against the American education system, which I think is in general quite a good system, is this idea of legacy student. You get into you have advantage in getting into a school only because that your parents or grandparents went there. These are completely weak rules. So that I think we are still far away from achieving equality of opportunity. But even if we can achieve it, it's not enough. I mean, some people say that that's the only equality that matters. You have to let everyone compete on equal basis, and you have to accept the result. I mean, fine, but the problem is that you may have the same rule, you may have the same opportunity, but people do not have the same capabilities. Simply because that race that everyone starts from the same starting point. It is not an equal race because some of the runners may be disabled. Some of them may have just one eye. Some of them may have only one leg. And you cannot call that competition equal. So if you want to make this equality of opportunity truly work, you need to ensure that everyone has similar levels of basic capabilities. And in order to ensure that, you need to ensure some degree of the equality of outcome, unless you want to raise everyone in the collective creche, kindergarten, like they do in I don't know, North Korea. So you need some degree of equality among the parents' generation to ensure that there's equal chance for the children's generation in terms of competition. And of course, you could go even deeper and discuss, who sets the rule. The content of the rule is affected by the worldview of the rule setters. So it is typically known that in universities like Oxford and Cambridge, that you have student interviews, and it's getting better, but typically the questions are kind of asked from a very privileged background, and then when the applicant doesn't deal with it very well from that point of view, they are considered stupid. So we could go even deeper and ask questions like, what is the truly fair rule? I mean, you can talk about equal opportunity in the sense that everyone plays by the same rule, but who sets the rule? That also needs to be inquired, and so on. So I think this requires a very kind of complicated conversation. I think it's nice to say, well, if you solve this, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, equal competition. I mean, I think that this problem cannot be reduced to any one of these.
Thank you very much. Actually, the previous question was asked by our colleagues, Professor Ha-Joon Lee, and I also have a couple of other questions. One is asked by Professor Mari Yoshida, and it's interesting. She mentions that Parasite is also a commentary on the alternative or afterlives of the Korean War and the ongoing Cold War, for example, bunkers, Morse code communication, and other related images. And Squid Game also illustrates some of the influence of American guests or the Westerners, some of the Chinese VIP, etc. So she would like to ask, your opinion. How would you address the role of the United States and other countries, especially with regard to neoliberalism? And related to the question, I think you can also address a question that has been asked by Professor Mingbao Yue. She also asks about the success of neoliberalism ties in South Korea. And I understand you had been quite critical about neoliberalism, and you are suggesting that there should be some move to correct the problems of neoliberalism. And I think you might say a few words. Where can we go in the future to address the problems that neoliberalism had been, given to South Korean society? Because of the limitation of time, I think this question will be the last question that we can address during this session. So, Dr. Chang.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the very important questions. So, in terms of Korea being influenced by, if you like, the world system, few countries are as big a victim of the international political system as Korea is, I mean, our division, the Korean War, it's at one of the very few places where the Cold War still rages on. The whole kind of societies that still very influenced by the military mentality, because half the population go to the army and get used to how things are organized. In companies that you have expressions like sasu and josu, which means basically the shooter and the helper, which is what people pick up from the kind of the military service. In many ways, the military mentality is still permeates, and then the particular influence of the U.S. Which is the most important piece in the kind of machine of the Cold War as far as Korea is concerned. It's huge. But the paradoxical thing is that actually the U.S. influence has become greater as Korea developed compared to the old days, because General Park and his military cronies might have given lip service to being good student of American free enterprise system, but these guys used to be communists. I mean, if you look at what they do, what they did, I mean, it's more from Karl Marx rather than Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman. So actually, they had that rather peculiar relationship with the U.S. But now the Korean societies basically being modeled after the U.S. And I mean, the spread of neoliberalism is actually closely linked with it. I mean, very few countries have escaped the influence of neoliberalism, but I think Korea got it in the pretty big dose because basically after the 97 financial crisis, people who were influenced by the US model, not simply because they studied there and stuff, but because, let's face it, the US model is the best model if you belong to the top 10%, if not top 1%. Yeah? So, the people wanted to have, the US level of the kind of freedom coming from money, the US level of freedom to basically exploit what people in the way that you want to exploit. So unfortunately, we now have become one of the most unequal societies in the rich world. What do we do about this? I think that the most important thing is to build a coalition around the idea of basically building a citizenship-based welfare state. I think that's the only platform which we can build a broad enough coalition to be able to reform the society in a major way. From there, exactly what you do, I think, is more debatable. But unless you create or rather recreate this sense of nationhood based on the idea that if you're a Korean citizen, you are entitled to basic security, in terms of the health, education, child upbringing, old age pension, and so on. I mean, unless you build a sense of new nationhood through these measures, it's not going to become what Britain used to be called in the 19th century, the country of two nations. Yeah? Nation of rich people and nation of poor people. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that it is a place for me to go into any detailed policy proposal, but I think that rebuilding the sense of nationhood by building a citizenship-based welfare state, even though I am not a specialist on welfare state, I think that is the most important thing that we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, our colleague, Professor Harrison Kim, raised a very interesting question at the last moment. And I think my colleague Sang-Hyun Lee wants to address a little bit. So can we use 20 seconds to raise this question?
No,
and then I will just make some concluding remarks.
So time is already over, and I have another meeting, so let's close. But the Harrison Kim's point is, why have a government like South Korea ignored this force of, inequality? Inequality is such an important topic issue, right? So why is still, right? So, and also more progressive government actually took the power. Then why is such a serious issue? Why it's not getting better? So that's the one question. So can you actually just, that's actually the thing. We don't have much time, but Ha-Joon, I really want to talk to you over these topics sometime much more. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
So Professor Chang, why don't you address it within 20 seconds?
Oh, well, I think that unfortunately the current government it hasn't done enough to kind of reframe the issue. What has it done? Raised the minimum wage at in a big way for 1 year, and that was about it. They are not even talking about building out the proper welfare state. They are worried about the budget deficit, and okay. I'm not saying the budget deficit is an unimportant issue, but they need to reframe the whole thing, because what they are doing is that essentially keeping the current frame and tinkering on the margin. And I don't think it's that going to solve any of the problems.
Thank you very much. This is, could you please show us? Yeah. So this is a very, very important issue in our Korean studies, I think. And it is a really challenging subject. And we, at the Center for Korean Studies, have been tackling this inequality problems in South Korea for a long time, I think, in last 5 years through core university project and also through strategic research initiative supported by Academy of Korean Studies, we are still working to explore what is the significance of the problem and what are possible kind of ways for us to take and to go. And Professor Chang's today's presentation also enriched all of our research that we had been working on. And I hope that this is the starting point of our further discussion. And we are really sorry that you could not join with us this time, but I hope you will be able to travel next time, and maybe over some drink we can discuss really in depth what we can do for the future of Korea and also for the future of the world. So thank you very much for your time and a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.